Greetings and salutations, welcome back to Colin's Last Stand right here on YouTube. My name is Colin Moriarty. I appreciate all of you out there being with me today and taking the time out of your day to watch this here video. Now, in recent weeks, a lot of you have complained that, Colin, you're doing too much in terms of politics and in too much of kind of contemporary coverage. We want a little bit more history, like the video I did about the moon base, or the video I did recently about the burning down of the White House, or the video about the Third Amendment, whatever the case might be. While I hear you loud and clear, and while there was a video that was more contemporary that I wanted to do today, I've actually bumped that video, I think, till Thursday, maybe even till next week. So I can do this video for you, which is actually, since I'm listening to all of you and reading your comments and reading your feedback, perhaps the most requested historical video that has been asked for so far, and that's about Andrew Jackson. Specifically, a lot of you asked me to go over the sort of funny stories about Andrew Jackson that have been told and that have been written about over the past, and I like telling those stories and I like reading about those stories, so that's what this video is dedicated to, sort of 4 or 5 funny and interesting and badass anecdotes about Andrew Jackson. But before I get into that, I thought I'd put a little bit of a preface to this in multiple parts. First of all, you should read John Meacham's American Lion. I'm not getting paid for this or whatever. This book came out almost 10 years ago. This is my copy. I bought this hardcover when it came out. John Meacham is a really great writer, a really great historical and political writer. He's often on the Sunday shows if you're a political nerd here in the United States. And American Lion is really the definitive story of Andrew Jackson, specifically during his presidency, and it's just a really, really great read. So a lot of people always ask, what's the book that I should read about Andrew Jackson? It's American Lion. The second thing I want to say is that Andrew Jackson is a controversial figure. Andrew Jackson was deeply racist in many ways. Andrew Jackson, of course, was a great enemy in many ways of American Indians, which was kind of ironic, kind of contrasting the Trail of Tears with the fact that he actually adopted 2 Native Americans as his own children. But nonetheless, he is a controversial and complicated man, and I am not getting into any of that. I am not excusing the things he has done. I'm not excusing or defending parts of his presidency, even though he actually is one of my favorite presidents and actually is a man I admire in many ways. But I understand to kind of negate the "what about Trail of Tears" comments in the comments. I'm not defending that, so I'm not talking about that. This isn't an all-encompassing look at Andrew Jackson. This is specifically just about stories that make him badass or make him funny in some ways, because as the title suggests, Andrew Jackson is America's favorite psychopath. So let's jump on in. So for those that don't know, Andrew Jackson was the 7th president of the United States, but he was born in the 1760s, and he actually had a pretty storied career. He ultimately ended up being a congressman and a senator and a military governor. He was a hero of the War of 1812. There was a lot of things that people really loved about Andrew Jackson, and one of the things that I respect most about him, in fact, was that he really, literally came from absolutely nothing. He came from complete destitution. His father died before he was born. His mother died when he was a teenager. He was kicked around from various family members. He worked hard. He was barely educated as a child, ended up becoming educated as an adult, became a lawyer. So there's a lot to admire, kind of the bootstraps mentality of Andrew Jackson, which is certainly worth reading about. And indeed, the very first story that I want to tell you occurs during this time, during this formidable sort of revolutionary era that I'm so obsessed with, when Andrew Jackson was but a young teenager and he got the scar on his hand and on his face that he was so well known for. Andrew Jackson was only 9 or 10 years old when the American Revolution kicked off in 1775 at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. But several years later, as the war moved from north to south, as the American Revolution did, really starting in New England, going through New York, and then ending up in the South, at least the heat of the battle, as it were, Andrew Jackson got himself involved when he was living in the Carolinas. And when he was 12 or 13 years old, he became a courier for the local militia. Push came to shove, and you can read some interesting stories about this time. Andrew Jackson actually kills his first man during this time. He's a young boy, 12, 13, 14 years old, killing someone for the first time during the Revolutionary War. But at some point in 1781, around the time that the war is about to wind down at Yorktown, with all of that with Cornwallis, Andrew Jackson is captured. And while he's captured, a British officer declares to him that he wants Andrew Jackson, the young courier, the young boy, to clean his boots. And Andrew Jackson purportedly not only refused to do it, but actually talked some shit and talked back to the British officer, saying things like, this isn't what's expected of a prisoner of war by normal conduct, that a British officer should be above asking someone for this. The British officer didn't take too kindly to this, so he unsheathed his sword and went to slash at Andrew Jackson. a blow that might have killed him, if not for the fact that he raised his hand in defense, and he got slashed across his left hand and then slashed across his face. The scar on his hand was a remembrance and a reminder to him of his deep hatred of the British, which was then reinvigorated some decades later during the War of 1812, when he became the hero of the Battle of New Orleans in 1814, again kind of fueled by that hatred of the British that happened when he was a POW as a young teenager to the British, being a dickhead to them, in an amazing little story. And if you want a little factoid, a little presidential factoid, Andrew Jackson is still, to this day, the only president to have been captured as a prisoner of war during warfare. But in any case, shortly after getting that injury, he actually contracted smallpox, which was basically a death sentence for many people at the time, during the Revolutionary period and even afterwards. But he did survive. He was released soon thereafter in 1782 and went about his business as the United States became a country. Now, if there's one thing you can say about Andrew Jackson, it's that he was a hard-drinking, smoking, partying, maybe even philandering in some of his younger years, sort of man. He was a partier. He was a nut job in a lot of different ways. And when you're fueled by alcohol and you're fueled by competitiveness and you have the testosterone, funneling through your veins, well, things happen, crazy things happen. And some of the crazy things that happened to Andrew Jackson was that he liked to get into duels. Now, I don't mean the sword fighting duels. I mean taking a gun and pointing it at another man and pulling the trigger and perhaps killing that man. And Andrew Jackson did kill his first man as a young teenager during the American Revolution, as I said, but during these duels, he did take some lives as well. Now, before I get into specifics, dueling during the 18th and 19th centuries, and even before that, was all about pride and honor. And many times when men would meet to duel, they would have seconds with them. That would be kind of the people that would make sure the rules were followed, whatever the rules set down by the primary duelers, whatever. But often the people would intentionally miss each other by shooting to the side, shooting up in the air. They would exchange some words. Pride would be saved, honor and face would be kind of preserved, and they would move on with their lives. But every once in a while, if you dueled as many times as Andrew Jackson was reported to have dueled, you're going to find yourself into some heated situations. And predictions widely range from how many duels Andrew Jackson actually got into. Some people say, and many people say, that there were probably no fewer than 10 duels, and maybe as many as 100, although with all of the mysticism surrounding Andrew Jackson, it's unlikely that he really dueled 100 times. But 10, 15 duels, possible, and a couple of them are definitely worth talking about. In 1806, Andrew Jackson ran into a man named Charles Dickinson. Charles Dickinson was a horse kind of trainer and was in on gambling around horse races. And there was some dispute between these two men about monies owed over a race and all of this. It's really not very important how they got to this point. Dickinson and Jackson hated each other thereafter, and Dickinson actually went after Jackson in the press and all this kind of stuff. Jackson, to protect his pride, challenged Dickinson to a duel. Now, Dickinson was known for his acumen with a gun and how well he shot and how good his aim was, which was especially poignant back in the 18th century and 19th century because of the inaccuracy of the guns, the way the ball would come out of muskets and sidearms. To be able to aim really well not only spoke to the quality craftsmanship of a weapon at the time, but also of the craftsmanship of the shooter, of the ability of the shooter to really hit his mark. And Dickinson was known for this. So when the two men dueled, Jackson actually let him shoot first, and Dickinson shot Andrew Jackson right in the chest, and the bullet lodged right next to Andrew Jackson's heart. Andrew Jackson, according to people at the scene, didn't even fall to a knee, didn't do anything other than take a handkerchief out of his pocket and kind of, dabbed and kind of put it over his wound, took his own gun, and shot Dickinson in the abdomen. Dickinson later died from his wound. Andrew Jackson clearly didn't die from his wound, but the bullet stayed inside of him for the rest of his life and actually caused him a lot of problems. It was way too close to the heart for 19th century surgeons to be able to safely extract the bullet and kind of clean up the wound properly. And some suggest that the lead seeping out into his body over the next few decades actually might have caused some ill health, because Andrew Jackson was a man known for having all sorts of diseases and debilitating problems. But nonetheless, he did win that duel after getting shot in the chest and living to tell the tale. And then years later, during the War of 1812, in which Andrew Jackson would make his name nationally as being, again, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, which was unfortunate considering the Battle of New Orleans really meant nothing because the Treaty of Ghent that stopped the War of 1812 had already really been signed and agreed to. But nonetheless, that's where Andrew Jackson kind of made a name for himself. And down there in the South during the war, Andrew Jackson ran into a couple of brothers who were not saying very nice things about him and his family. And by all accounts, in Nashville at the time where this fight and this duel took place, there was all sorts of ruckus. People were street fighting. Andrew Jackson's kind of entourage was known for being quite fucking insane on their own. Everyone was throwing punches or whatever. At some point, Andrew Jackson, during this kind of foray, is shot both in his shoulder and in his arm. And the doctors at the time were begging him to let them amputate his arm because they were afraid that bad things were going to happen. He was going to get disease or was going to get infected, whatever the case might be. But he refused to let them do any of that, dealt with this terrible pain and the sickness and the risk of what it would do to the rest of his body if they didn't amputate. And he ended up living to tell the tale as well. And interestingly, I was reading another account of a dispute Andrew Jackson had with John Sevier, who was the first governor of the state of Tennessee, and how the men agreed to duel at some point over Sevier's kind of ill words on Rachel, who was Andrew Jackson's wife. And if you don't know anything about Rachel Jackson, she was in another marriage, and she might not have even been divorced when Andrew Jackson married her, and there was all sorts of rumors about her and stuff, and Andrew Jackson took this very seriously indeed. And apparently Sevier never showed up to where they were supposed to duel, and when he was going back home, Andrew Jackson happened to run into him on the road and ended up drawing his gun and chasing the man down the road, and the man apparently hid behind some trees or whatever, and they exchanged words, and people had to separate them, and they went on their separate ways. Andrew Jackson, clearly a hothead. Perhaps my favorite story of all, though, is when Andrew Jackson was almost assassinated. Now, I told you earlier in the video that Andrew Jackson was the only president to ever be held as a POW during warfare, and that's true. But at the time, Andrew Jackson was the only and really the first president to ever have an attempt on his life occur. And that's a pretty miraculous thing when you consider the times and when you consider just the way things go now. The last president to have, in our modern times, have an attempt on his life was actually Ronald Reagan. But they got through George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, and John Quincy Adams, and all the way to Andrew Jackson, number 7, before any attempt on any of their lives happened. So it's a pretty interesting story in and of itself. But the story goes that Andrew Jackson, at age 67, was at the Capitol for a congressman's funeral, a wake. And as they were leaving the building, him and his entourage, a man walks up to him. The man's name is Richard Lawrence, and Richard Lawrence is just a painter. He's just a working class American who happens to be completely insane, and as we would later find out, might have actually been kind of instigated into doing this because Andrew Jackson refused him a civil servant's job. So nonetheless, regardless of why it happened, here's what went down. Paces away from Andrew Jackson at the Capitol, Richard Lawrence holds up a gun and goes to shoot it, and it jams. Andrew Jackson realizes in the moment what's happening. This man's trying to assassinate him. And at 67 years old, takes the hickory cane he was known to be walking around with and goes and attempts to beat the man to death. The man pulls out another pistol and tries to shoot Jackson with it, and the gun jams again. Now, this is an extraordinary thing in and of itself. The guns were examined after the fact by some professionals, some people in the know, and they realized that both guns were perfectly functioning guns. They were properly loaded, they had powder, they had bullets, all the kinds of things, but they just jammed. And they were saying at the time, and it has since been confirmed, that the chance of that happening, of both guns jamming, having been properly loaded, was 1 in 125,000. But nonetheless, Lawrence is promptly tackled by Jackson's entourage as Jackson goes and maybe gets a few more blows in on him. And my favorite part of this particular element of the story is that it's none other than Davy Crockett who helps beat the shit out of the assassin as he's being assailed by all these people and Jackson himself. So Davy Crockett himself, the man, the legend, was on the scene as an assassin tried to take Andrew Jackson's life in the very first attempt on a president to take a president's life with 2 jammed guns, with 1 in 125,000 chance of that happening. A pretty extraordinary story. And if you're curious, Richard Lawrence was found not guilty by reason of insanity after a very short jury deliberation. He actually thought that he was Richard III, the King of England, who actually died in the 1400s, and claimed that Andrew Jackson killed members of his family or whatever. He was clearly fucking crazy, and he actually died in 1861, right when the Civil War started several decades later. But Andrew Jackson got a few clocks in on him before all was said and done, so good enough. The final stories I want to tell you about have to do with partying, specifically about Andrew Jackson's inauguration party and then Andrew Jackson's farewell party, which were amazing bookends to his 8 years in the White House and really symbolic not only of his populist support, but that he was a man of the people and that the shit was going on at the White House both before and after his presidency, completely out of control. The year was 1829. Andrew Jackson had beaten John Quincy Adams in the race of 1828 to become president. They had actually ran against each other 4 years earlier than that as well. And so Andrew Jackson wanted to celebrate. His party had won. His people are in. How are they going to go about it? For starters, Andrew Jackson delivers a pretty short inaugural address and then rides his own horse through a crowd of thousands of people to the White House across the other side of Washington, D.C. So picture that. Andrew Jackson kind of galloping along on his horse. Everyone's enamored by the man, the legend. A lot of people would say he's probably the most famous living American at the time. So this was a big deal for people to spot him with their own two eyes. Remember, this was long before things like television and film and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, if you might see later a daguerreotype or something of him, or you might see a drawing of him, but to see him in the flesh, it's a pretty big deal. And tens of thousands of people descended on Washington, D.C. to do just that. It's also important to note that the White House was a completely different place at this time. The White House didn't have all these wings, and it wasn't this extravagant building that you see now. It doesn't look any different if you look at it from the front, but if you look at it from the top, you see that it's really this sprawling complex where lots and lots of people work, and it wasn't like that back in the day. Washington, D.C. was not the metropolitan capital that it is now, and it wasn't beyond the pale to go to the White House and actually shake hands with the president or be able to meet with him at some point. So people went with the expectation that they were going to see Andrew Jackson. They were going to be able to shake his hand, meet him, drink with him, and do all those kinds of things. And so people were very, very excited. People, perhaps 20,000 of them or more, were at the White House, on the lawn, in the building, going fucking insane. They were drinking, they were smoking, they were eating, they were fighting, they were stealing shit and destroying shit. The White House apparently was not in great shape. Andrew Jackson himself went into the party and couldn't get out and actually had to crawl out a window to get out of his own party, with everyone partying and screaming and going crazy and smoking all around him. And apparently the White House staff had to take the drinks, the center of which were this punch bowl that was being served, and this punch that was being served heavily spiked with whiskey. And they brought it out to the lawn along with food and all that kind of stuff to get people out of the building, because everyone was so drunk and so hammered at this time that they were following basically the scent of the whiskey. And so they got them out of the building by promising them more free drinks and free food out on the lawn. It apparently worked, but not before a ton of damage was done to the White House. And it's not that coincidental, perhaps, that Andrew Jackson later asked Congress not too long after the inauguration for about $50,000 in 1828 money or 1829 money in order to renovate and kind of fix things in the White House. It is worth noting that historians since then have said that some of the stories coming out of that particular inauguration might be overblown. Not necessarily the amount of people that were there, but the amount of damage that was done and the intent of the people doing the damage. Some people suggest that the White House was just so jam-packed with people during Andrew Jackson's inauguration that he had no choice but to crawl out the window, and people had no choice but to bump into things, and they were dropping things because they didn't mean to do any harm, but that they did. But nonetheless, it's worth throwing in that, you know, over the couple of centuries since this has happened, almost 2 centuries since this has happened, that there is some revisionist history that suggests that it might not be as wild as it seems, at least from the destruction standpoint. And it's also worth noting that Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams hated each other so much. They had such a disdain for each other going back many years at that point, and even at least 4 years before to the election of 1824, that they coordinated not one bit. Think about Trump and even Obama, who don't like each other, how they coordinated, how they talked to each other. Obama had Trump over to the White House a couple times. None of that happened. So even things like security broke down. And so the inauguration and the party at the White House apparently lacked any sort of security force or anyone to really help out in an organized way. And that might be able to be traced back to the disdain that those two men held for each other. But not to be outdone, Andrew Jackson wanted to throw a rager for when he left in 1837 as well, as his vice president, Martin Van Buren, took over the reins as the 8th president of the United States. And the focal point of this particular party was a massive 1,400-pound block of cheese sent to him by a dairy farmer from upstate New York, who also sent blocks of cheese to other leaders, including Martin Van Buren. But this was the biggest one of them all. This time, at least 10,000 people came to the White House for the kind of farewell ball, farewell gala that happened there. And again, this block of cheese was meant to feed everyone. And the block of cheese, which again was 1,400 pounds in terms of weight, and it was 4 feet in diameter and 2 feet thick, with patriotic quotes apparently written on the wrapping around it, disappeared completely in 2 hours. Those 10,000 or more people had a lot of cheese, but the cheese lingered long thereafter. For starters, once the cheese was punctured and they were getting through the casing and they were starting to eat it, apparently the cheese was so pungent in terms of its aroma that it could be smelled blocks away in Washington, D.C., and people were complaining about how disgusting it smelled. But it got even worse because when Martin Van Buren moved into the White House, he had to have that entire room renovated. The word was that the residue left behind by the cheese and the smell was so pungent in that area of the White House that Van Buren had to have the carpets aired out. He had to have the upholstery and the curtains and all that kind of stuff thrown away and replaced. He had to have the building painted and all that kind of stuff. And finally, they got rid of that stench of Andrew Jackson's cheese that was enjoyed, all 1,400 pounds of it, by 10,000 people, saying goodbye to Old Hickory himself, the man, the myth, the legend. All right, so that's it for Colin's Last Stand. I hope you enjoyed this history-centric episode of the show, just as requested. Please share it with your friends, your family members. Give it a thumb up if you like it, and a thumb down if you didn't. Remember, I'll be in the comments to speak with you when this video goes live, and I'll be kind of returning to kind of talk to you guys, so keep the comments going. Please follow me on Twitter. Join us on Reddit. We have a great community over there. We also have a community, a fan-run community on Facebook you might be interested in. And please, if you don't mind, go over to patreon.com/ColinsLastStand and throw me $1, $5, $10 a month to make this ad-free, independent, historical, and political content run. I really do appreciate you so very much. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you have a great rest of your day and that you enjoyed these stories that hopefully you can pass along to some of your friends and family and impress them with your knowledge of Andrew Jackson, the American Lion. I'll see you guys next time. Keep on learning.